Could you talk about writing like that? I mean, I sort of couldn't help but thinking of poets like Gertrude Stein, maybe
Yeah.
even more than playwrights.
Oh,
But how did you sort of come to this writing style?
Oh, that's yeah. No, Gertrude is a really big influence, especially Dr. Faustus Lights the Lights, which it's on my shelf, and anytime I don't really feel like writing or I'm not feeling particularly inspired, I sit down and I reread it. So yeah, Gertrude Stein's a big influence. Carol Churchill. There's especially late Carol Churchill. There's a touch of her in this play. But it was writing. It was a bit like playing a game of Jenga, which was the dialogue was more complete, and then I would just sort of, in the course of workshopping it with actors, see how many words I could remove from the sentences and still have it make sense.
And so what is that like? Is it very difficult for the act? I mean, you have an amazing cast, so they sort of really make it look effortless, but it couldn't be.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the first time that the actors sit down and read the script out loud, you simply say, well, take out all of the air in between the lines and just blast through it. And it kind of comes off well. And then you start the rehearsal process where people are saying, okay, wait, so what do those two words mean? What would be the complete sentence? And there does exist a version of the script that has the complete lines, that if you were to finish those lines, the complete sentences are written. And we called it the cheat sheet or the answer key. But we kept it out of the actor's hands as much as possible because there's something more interesting about having to figure it out on your own. Yeah. That actually, when you sort of sit down and read the answer key, in some ways, when you then go to deliver the lines, they're too heavy-handed. You know, it's hitting you over the head too much with what the line reads. So it wants to kind of hover somewhere in a slightly ambiguous space. So that, I mean, hopefully what happens is that your experience of watching it, you're actually hearing more complete sentences than are even on the page, that your brain kind of fills in the rest in a way that you don't realize that you're filling in the rest.
Can you talk about the conceit of the screenplay reading? Because that adds a layer to it that allows for all sorts of things. I mean, it allows, first of all, the idea that Walt Disney is himself the author. You know, who is the public that he's referring to, or the title is referring to? It's the audience.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big question that Sarah and I were talking about a lot at the beginning of the process. Who is this for? And you know, we ultimately came up with the simple answer. Well, it's whoever came to see the play tonight. Yeah. But the conceit of when I went to NYU for both undergrad and grad school, and I did my undergrad in with a focus on playwriting, and then they made a deal with me where if I came back for one more year, they would give me an MFA. And so I said, okay, well, I just want to take screenwriting classes for that one last year because I never really took any screenwriting classes. And when you finish your MFA, you have a thesis reading of a screenplay, and screenplay readings are incredibly boring. It is actually, they're just not really written to be read aloud. Yeah. The screen directions, or the term that people use is, it's called the across the page, all of those screen directions. That tends not to be all that interesting to listen to. We kind of want to hear dialogue, but then the dialogue's constantly being interrupted by across the page. So I had written a thesis screenplay, and I decided, so that my reading wouldn't be terribly boring, I rewrote the screenplay to work for a public reading. And it meant actually sort of stealing a good bit from Gertrude Stein and sort of incorporating some narration into the dialogue. And so this sort of weird hybrid thing came about. And I always thought that was kind of interesting, and was always interested in returning back to that at some point.
Could you talk about, I mean, the phrase that's used the most in the script or the play is cut to, and you use it in such an evocative way, and of course it has an amazing payoff at the ending, but could you talk about your thoughts? Because you're sometimes cutting to different scenes, but very often you're not. You're just cutting to the next line of dialogue.
Yeah, so the funny thing about it is, actually, if you're going to go out and write a screenplay, you're typically advised these days never to use cut to. People don't use cut to anymore in screenplays. There was a time, I think 80s and before that, people would use cut to in screenplays, but you don't do it.
Now they will.
Bring cut to back. It was something that in the very, very first versions of the script just showed up like 2 or 3 times, and then it just occurred to me that, well, if the action of performing, if Walt performing this screenplay is going to be active, he needs to be editing the thing as it goes along. And cut to became actually the clearest, simplest way to just edit. Cut to, you skip ahead. And you're right. There are times when it actually just jumps us ahead microseconds, and there are times when it's jumping us ahead 6 months. And I kind of enjoy the feeling of watching. I find it pleasurable to sort of always be trying to figure out, wait, how much did we just skip ahead? Right. And sort of realizing it after the fact, or just like a microsecond after the cut to, how much further we moved along. And hopefully at a certain point, it just sort of becomes a musical effect that's sort of jumping us through this really fractured film as it kind of unravels.
Now, could you talk about your relationship with Walt Disney? I think one of the points of the play, of course, is that we all have our own experiences with Disney, and you're showing us, you've decided on different, sort of sides of Disney that we don't usually see, from the nature documentaries to focusing on his, death. But.
Well, the relationship, because I grew up about 7 minutes from Disney World. I grew up in a geodesic dome house that was on a back road that you would take to get to Disney World, and so we always had tourists stopping in front of our house to take a picture and asking us if our house had anything to do with Epcot. But Disney was my backyard. I mean, when my family and I would go somewhere, it would be to go somewhere on Disney property, because they had parks and facilities that were free and open to the public, and everything on the Disney property has this amazing, impeccable Disney design. Everything is micromanaged to create a particular effect. You are never lost when you are on Disney property. There are always very clear waypoints. You always know where to go. So my association with Disney and the Disney aesthetic is actually a very fond one. I find it incredibly comforting. I love micromanagement. I get really upset when there's bad signage, and I get really upset when I don't know where I'm supposed to stand, and I attribute it to Disney, because I just I was surrounded by a place where you always knew where you were supposed to stand. So I have an incredible fondness actually for this desperate attempt at control, and I kind of identify with it. I would say that the play is. I think it's very safe to say the play is probably more about me than it is actually the person Walt Disney, and my sort of efforts to sort of, when making a play or making anything, to sort of control every single little tiny aspect of it, have everybody do exactly what I want them to do, but it is an aspect of the person too. I mean, at least if. Well, here's the funny thing. When you go and research Disney, it's really hard to sort of figure out what's true and what's not. Myths seem to sprout up around the guy. The most common one being that if you ask 8 out of 10 people on the street, was Disney cryogenically frozen? They'll say, oh yeah, he was. Most people think he was. Sure. There's a really telling quote from Walt Disney that sort of stuck in my head, which is, "You can't just let nature run wild." and I identify with that, and I'm scared of what happens when nature runs wild. But so that sort of ended up being sort of a point of access for me. I was interested in whatever mind had that thought, whatever mind had that feeling that, well, you can't just let nature run wild.
And you discovered the nature. I mean, the nature documentaries, that piece of his filmmaking career was something you discovered, and that's an interesting aspect, because you don't think of Disney the idea that he would be interested in documentaries where you have to sort of deal with reality rather than something you control.
Richard Schickel writes one of the best biographies of Disney out there, and he spends at least a good portion of a whole chapter focusing on this part of Disney's career, where he, at a certain point, commissioned film crews to get this nature footage, and the footage that these crews made was of an unparalleled quality. It was sort of equivalent to the Planet Earth Blu-ray that came out a couple of years ago that everybody just went wild over because it was just such amazing footage that no one's ever seen anything like it. Well, that's what these nature documentaries were like when they came out. And Schickel sort of writes about how it's kind of, in a sense, disappointing that he went out there and got this amazing footage and then would edit it into these films that had sort of this dopey soundtrack and this folksy narrator describing bears and how bears are really good at scratching their butts on trees and then imposing all these very human narratives on the lives of these bears. And that some people have criticized the nature documentaries for finding that the only way for people to actually care about nature is if it's just like us. The bears, they're just like people. And that struck me as being a really interesting starting place for the play, which is this man goes out to the world and attempts to represent it, and in the course of representing it, egregiously misrepresents it because of an effort to make something easier to understand or more accessible or more, the word I hate so much is relatable, which the implicit meaning of relatable is if it's not like me, then I don't like it. So that seemed to be an interesting starting place.
And you actually don't, what's interesting is that you sort of ask the audience to bring their memories of the Disney films. I mean, you don't actually show that or deal with that in the play, but we all are thinking of, all the animated films and this sort of quaint, Disney vision of the world compared to what you present, which has a element of tragedy. So I do want to ask you about there is a very strong aspect of King Lear.
Yeah, and that was sort of again, at the very beginning of the process, I needed some sort of story to work from, and I for whatever reason, I really love King Lear, and I thought, okay, well, this is just a King Lear story. I'll try to tell it as a King Lear story. And so that was just something to sort of help me have some shape to begin with. I mean, it's actually not at all structured like King Lear, but the story points are there. You have this guy who is about to leave his kingdom, and yet he's trying to control the future of that kingdom even beyond his rule, and how that backfires. I
wanted to bring up Shakespeare because Shakespeare, of course, made a pretty good career out of dealing with historical figures, which is something you've done in your plays about the Clintons and Anna Nicole Smith and Isaac Newton. So could you talk about that? You have this interesting idea about that you've talked about stereoscopic theater, where the audience is bringing their ideas of a character and then you bring yours, and we sort of...
Yeah, well, the one of the early versions of 3D illusions involved a little glasses setup where you have two images that are slightly different from each other side by side. And the device sort of tricks the brain into trying to see those images as one. And what you get as a result is something that's three-dimensional or has the illusion of three-dimensionality. And I think it's kind of interesting to sort of take an icon or a figure that we're all familiar with. So Anna Nicole Smith, for example. We all have this really, with variation, of course, but this sort of very two-dimensional image of that person. Former stripper, married a really wealthy old guy. We all think she married him for his money, and we have the images of the Guess ads in our head, and it's a sort of a vapid image. And then I'm interested in sort of making a play about a character, and I'm going to name her Anna Nicole Smith, and she's going to share some of the same story points, but she's going to be in terms of character, very, very different from that image. And in fact, in casting it, we're not even going to cast somebody who looks remotely like Anna Nicole Smith. We're going to cast somebody who's older than Anna Nicole Smith, and at the point that the play is taking place, and has brown hair instead of blonde hair. And so you're being told that the character that you're watching is Anna Nicole Smith, but in so many ways she doesn't resemble her. But again, I have this theory that what the brain will do is try to combine the two images anyway. And what you get is sort of this sort of uncanny, sticky, intriguing image of a character. And the shorter way of saying it, I'm just really interested in taking two-dimensional images and smashing them in some way with either something that's three-dimensional or something that's equally two-dimensional, but that sort of complicates the image that we already have.
One of the things that's been happening, this is kind of an interesting moment for Disney. There's a lot of images of Disney out there, artists who are working with that. I mean, there's just this Sunday in the New York Times Magazine, there was a piece about the artist Paul McCarthy who created this kind of haunting image of Disney, with Walt Disney with his trousers down and looking kind of like Hitler. There was a film, Escape to Tomorrow at Sundance this year, where a filmmaker sort of went into Disney World unauthorized and, made a low budget feature film, and these are sort of unauthorized images of Disney. Who, when you think of Disney, you immediately think of lawyers controlling. And so I'm wondering how that, because part of what you're doing here is sort of fighting against that control, the Disney control of the Walt Disney image, and you're creating your own. I'm just wondering if sort of legal considerations came into mind, or the idea that you're sort of working against like the official image of Walt Disney.
Well, I mean, no. To my knowledge, the Disney Corporation has not contacted us or objected, so there's not really a legal concern. And this falls under the category of parody, so it's totally. And at the same time, I would not. I'm not professing to write a bioplay, and while there's stuff in the play that is factual or at least documented, I won't even vouch for the truth of that stuff. I mean, I don't know if the books that I've read are telling me the truth.
Right.
So, in terms of, I would just as soon say this is all fiction. But I mean, there is an incredible pleasure in just sort of taking, you look at these sort of gods of our time, and to sort of cross into their realm and sort of own it with my own story. There's something very transgressive about it, and it's sort of it makes the whole process of writing feel a little bit naughty and fun, and it actually keeps me writing because I feel like I'm doing a bad thing. Because so much of the play the scenes that play out are just really transcriptions of things that have happened to me. I mean, they're just like my own personal junk up on stage, and I just call it Walt Disney. So there's something sort of fun about and naughty about doing that. And again, I'm calling it right now fiction, and I hope I haven't offended any of the Disney family. I'm sure Walt was a lovely, lovely person.
Well, we have time for some questions from the audience. So we'll take a few. I'll repeat them just so people can hear. Over here.
Hi. I really like the daughter character, and I was wondering, are any elements of that true, and where she comes from? And I just thought it was just.
So the daughter character, was that based on truth? Where did that characterization come from?
So a couple of things about that. So the daughter's the only character that's not named in the play, and Disney had two daughters, and I sort of conflated the two characters. But the reason why she's not named, the big reason why is I don't consider her a public figure, so it didn't seem right to name her in the play and base it too much on the real person. Whereas Walt, Roy, and Ron, I consider them public figures in more fair game. But there's a bit of it comes from a book by, the stuff that happens in the play. Let's see. Walt making threats to not include her in the will, Walt insisting on naming one of her kids after him. Those are sort of the two details about her that stick out the most. I believe both of them came from the same book by Mark Elliott, and I'm trying to remember the title of that book. It's something like Disney the Dark Prince or something like that. So already with the title of the book, you kind of go in suspecting that maybe portions of the book may not be true. But that book actually had some fairly salacious details about Disney and his relationship with his family, including actually that book also I think is the one that alleged that Walt had a temper tantrum where he threw cake at a wedding. It was either a wedding or his birthday party, and then it also alleged that he threw an Oscar at Roy's head, or towards Roy's head. So, but again, I have no reason for believing or doubting the book, except my gut tells me that there's something that seems a little exaggerated about that book. But it is based on some things that are alleged in at least that book, but maybe another one. I forget now.
Finishing each other's sentences. And my take on it was that they'd have to know each other so well in order to do this.
Yeah.
But he's in effect trying to control them all too. So where are you going with it?
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, one of the effects of sort of having people finish each other's sentences so much is it does kind of create an intimacy between the characters, or at least something kind of symbiotic, which is interesting, and I actually think probably useful for character and just bonding the people together on stage. One of the reasons why the dialogue's written like that is because I wanted the thing to go really fast, like it felt like a ride that was a little bit out of control. And one of the things that kind of happens, and I'm going to say right out, I totally stole this from Carol Churchill in a play called Drunk Enough to Say I Love You, where she also orchestrates incredibly fast dialogue, is that I found that the effect of that was that it made the characters simultaneously people having a conversation, and they became kind of mythic at the same time, because the world moved faster than the characters. They are describing things in time that are moving faster than they are. So you get this kind of effect where the characters are, you can almost imagine the characters are giants walking across the land, walking across the countries. And there are moments in the play that feel that way to me, especially when time speeds up really fast, or you have that scene where Walt's in the airplane looking down, or in the sky bar looking down. There's that effect. And I don't know, I feel like the speed of the dialogue actually kind of helps with that effect.
Okay, right down here.
So you mentioned that in writing the play, things were much more fleshed out in the beginning, and then working with actors, it sort of whittled down. Sort of how did the script change in this particular production? Were you there on the day-to-day, and what was that development like? So
the play was originally developed with a really close friend and director named Jonna Brown, and a group of actors, Andrew Grusetsky, Mike Mim, Amy Statz, and Ryan Bronze, and we worked together pretty intensely over the course of roughly 3 workshops, and sort of presenting it to friends on several occasions. So the script changed most drastically during that initial workshop process. And then when Sarah became involved, we did a reading at the Prelude Festival, which was really just a great opportunity to see, okay, does the script still work with different actors than the ones who originated the roles? Because that can sometimes happen where you work with a group of actors and they sort of fuse with the play, and then you give it to another set of actors, and the whole thing just falls apart. And it worked great, and Sarah took a different spin on it, and it still worked. So coming into rehearsal, the script seemed in pretty solid shape, but there were changes that were very small but important. For example, in the first scene, you'll notice several times there will be a sentence like, the camera cuts to, and we cut to, and using the cut to in fuller sentences that makes more explicit and then we cut to, and then the camera cuts to. That kind of trains us to know what cut to means, because I found that if I didn't do that, people are like, what is that cut to? And like little things like that to just sort of make sure that certain things are going to be, certain details, certain aspects of the story or the storytelling are definitely going to be clearer, hopefully clear to 95% of the audience. Those were the types of changes that were made.
You said Sarah took it into a different direction than the initial impulse. Can you talk a little bit about what that was for you, and what that departure was?
Yeah, I mean, right at the outset, I didn't want to tell Sarah anything about the workshops that were done. I didn't want to tell her anything about how it was staged. I wanted her to make all of those initial decisions herself. So, you know, I mean, gosh, everything from like having Walt speak into a microphone. That was never part of the earlier versions. It actually seems like a small thing, but it makes a really big difference. It makes all the across the page stand out differently. It just even leaning into the microphone makes the across the page seem like more of a decision. Having the microphone there on the cut twos gives you the ability, as the play continues on, to have subtext in the cut twos. You can actually say a cut two that has remorse in it. Whereas if you're just sort of speaking it, we're not going to be able to pick up on that. This environment, I mean, it was Sarah's idea to sort of really build an environment for the play. I mean, as written, the play, you can just do it in any old room. You can do it in a rehearsal hall. But the decision to make it kind of this corporate throne room was definitely something that Sarah brought to the process. I mean, so much. The magic elements is something that she brought in. Bringing in Annie B to actually, it's one of these type of things that you probably don't even notice if you don't know it, but every single gesture in the play is choreographed, and that level of precision was something really exciting that she brought.
I have a first statement and a quick question. I thought I was really surprised that lemmings don't throw themselves off.
Me too.
It really had the effect of kind of like, I think, of what you want to have happen in some way, which is to kind of tear the curtain off. Then the points at the ending reminded me of Craps Last Tape by Beckett, and was that an influence at all, or was that just a coincidence?
It's funny. I think more likely. Well, I love Beckett. Of his plays, Craps Last Tape is not one that I think about that much. Not because I don't like it or anything, but because I'm obsessed with Endgame. I love Endgame. But I think, I mean, the fact is, I think I'm really influenced by a lot of people who were influenced by Craps Last Tape. So I think indirectly it came there. But yeah, I think you're right to point that out. I think the ghost of Craps Last Tape is in the room.
Okay, well, we'll end on that note, but thank you so much and congratulations.